Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I will be discussing a legendary creature from Dominaria, Marwyn the Nurturer. If you're a patron of my channel, then chances are you saw this episode earlier. Marwyn is a 1/1 elf druid for 2 generic and 1 green. Whenever an elf creature enters the battlefield under your control, she gets a +1/+1 counter. In and of itself, that's a great ability since she can get crazy big in an elf tribal deck. However, true to her creature types, she can tap down for green mana. And how much mana can she tap for? The same amount of green mana as her power. This leads to some obvious interactions such as infinite mana, infinite power, etc. So I'll get to that soon enough. First, let's see how we're going to be increasing her power. One of the obvious ways to do it is to just chock the deck full of elves. However, that wouldn't be as efficient as it would seem. That being said, it is the most to-the-point way of pumping Marwyn. This is why the deck runs 25 elves apart from Marwyn. So let's see first which ones increase her power more so than just by entering the battlefield. Timberwatch Elf is able to tap down and give Marwyn an epic boost if you have a bunch of elves in play, which most of the time we do. Even then, just a handful of elves are enough to have Marwyn tap down for a ton of mana, thanks to Timberwatch Elf. One of the best elves to pump Marwyn is also a great mana sink for her ability. Jiraga Warcaller has a multi-kicker where if you sink a bunch of mana into it, it enters the battlefield with a ton of +1/+1 counters. Then, other elves you control get +1/+1 for each of those counters on it. Not only does this make Marwyn even bigger to tap down for more mana, but it also makes all of your other elves dangerous by making them incredibly large. Another great mana sink pump effect is Ezuri Renegade Leader. Similar to Jiraga Warcaller, Ezuri can provide a win con via beatdown if enough mana is sunk into his overrun ability. Additionally, as a bonus, Ezuri can be used to regenerate other elves by paying just 1 green mana for each one. He might not be able to regenerate himself, but at least he can save other clutch elves, Marwyn in particular. With the Chroma's Memorial in play, pumping your elves with Ezuri can make them especially dangerous since they're going to have Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, Haste, and Protection from Black and Red. It might cost 7 to cast, but that's very doable in a mono green deck. It also gives haste to mana dorks, so there's that as well. But its boons are definitely perfect for a creature deck like this one. Other pump effects come from elf lords like Elvish Archdruid, Imperious Perfect, and Immaculate Magistrate. Immaculate Magistrate is even more brutal when combined with Jiraga Warcaller, since putting a +1/+1 counter on all elves when it's in play essentially translates into making your elves bigger by +2/+2. Since it gives +1/+1 counters, these can also be proliferated with Karn's Bastion. Imperious Perfect not only pumps other elves by +1/+1, but you can also pay 1 green and tap it down to create a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token, a token that, when entering the battlefield, gives Marwyn a +1/+1 counter. Elvish Archdruid also gives a static +1/+1 boost to all other elves, but it can also tap down to add 1 green mana to your mana pool for each elf you have on the battlefield. Another way to pump creatures is with Oran Reef the Vastwood. This land can tap to give a +1/+1 counter to all green creatures that enter the battlefield that turn. This is amazing on its own, but is even better with the aforementioned Karn's Bastion. On the topic of adding absurd amounts of mana to your mana pool, elves are the quintessential mana dorks. This is why the deck runs all the cheap ones like Boreal Druid, Elvish Mystic, Fyndhorn Elves, and Llanowar Elves. Each of these elves can tap down for 1 mana while also casting 1 mana. Casting any of these on turn 1 allows for a turn 2 Marwyn. Also, being so cheap to cast means that even if you cast them mid to late game, they can still grant Marwyn a +1/+1 counter for just 1 green mana when cast. A similar effect can be found on Arbor Elf. Although it doesn't tap for mana, it can tap to untap a forest, which is just a very roundabout way of adding 1 green mana to your mana pool. That being said, Arbor Elf's true usefulness lies in untapping dual lands and enchanted forests. Another mana dork included in the deck is Elvish Harbinger. Although included more for the fact that it can tutor for an elf and put it on top of the library, once it enters the battlefield it can trigger Marwyn. Then it can tap for mana. Definitely a great elf to include in this deck. Other mana dorks within the deck include Priest of Titania and Wirewood Channeler. Although they don't grant a static boon like Elvish Archdruid does, Priest of Titania can still tap down to produce as much green mana as elves you control, while Wirewood Channeler can produce the same amount of any one color, even though it will more than likely tap for green. This can generate an absurd amount of mana as well. Notwithstanding, there are other similar elves like Selvala, Heart of the Wilds, and Viridian Joiner. These two are similar to Marwyn in that they can tap to produce mana depending on the power of a singular creature rather than the amount of creatures, although the Joiner is only for its own power. You have to pay 1 green to activate Selvala, but at least she can add any combination of colors. However, more often than not, she's tapping for green mana. What's most important about these elves within the deck is that they function as substitutes for Marwyn should she get dealt with. Since Marwyn has the potential of generating infinite mana in this deck, so do some of these elves. Let's see how we accomplish that. The artifacts needed are Umbral Mantle, Sword of the Parents, and Staff of Domination. Each of these have an effect that allows us to continuously untap a creature so long as we produce a net gain in mana each time. The elves that can go infinite with these artifacts are the aforementioned Marwyn the Nurturer, Elvish Archdruid, Priest of Titania, Wirewood Channeler, Selvala Heart of the Wilds, and Viridian Joiner. That means that there's a total of 21 2-card combinations with the potential of generating infinite mana. So let's see what each one would need given the case. Marwyn and Viridian Joiner with 3 power can go infinite with Umbral Mantle. Whenever you activate the Mantle's ability, it pumps the creature it's equipped to. So once you start this combo, it's guaranteed to generate infinite mana with these creatures. So you only need an initial investment of 3 mana, which is why they need 3 power to activate it. With Sword of the Parents, they get +2/+0 for being tapped down. Since you tap them down as part of the cost of the ability, they're going to have 2 extra power when their ability checks their power. Thus, they'll produce 4 green mana. Using 3 to activate the sword generates a innate gain of 1 green mana. With Staff of Domination, they need to have a power of 5 to generate infinite mana with it. 3 mana is used to activate the staff to untap either one of these creatures, while 1 is used to untap the staff. This leaves a net gain of 1 mana after each cycle. Priest of Titania, Elvish Archdruid, and Wirewood Channeler would each need 3 other elves on the battlefield in order to produce infinite mana with either Umbral Mantle or Sword of the Parents. With Staff of Domination, they'd need 5 other elves on the battlefield to do so. Selvala would need to be able to generate 4 mana in order to go infinite with Umbral Mantle, 5 mana to go infinite with Sword of the Parents, and 6 mana to go infinite with Staff of Domination. Since some of these creatures depend on having a high power in order to generate mana, the deck runs ways of moving around power between creatures. Stoneforge Masterwork gives a creature +1/+1 for every other creature that shares its creature type. Essentially, this makes any elf get +1/+1 for every other elf. It's cheap to cast and cheap to equip, so it's definitely amazing in a tribal deck like this one. Blackblade Reforged is also crazy good in this deck thanks to all the ramp, which I'll eventually discuss. Although it can be equipped to any creature, equipping it to Marwyn or Selvala would cost only 3 generic to do. Doing so will make them big enough to generate an insane amount of mana while also turning them into a huge beater. Okay, so now we have infinite mana. So what? Well, we can sink that infinite mana into Staff of Domination itself in order to gain infinite life, or just draw into your deck until you find a win con. One of those being Squall Line. With the infinite life from the staff as well as the infinite mana, you can sink enough into this in order to kill off all of your opponents. Squall Line is great on its own too, since it could also be used to clear the skies of threats as well as taking a huge chunk of life from your opponents. You'll also be hit by it, but the deck has ways of gaining life apart from Staff of Domination. You can also sink infinite mana into the aforementioned Jiraga Warcaller and Ezuri to make all of your elves be infinity. Ezuri also gives them trample, so unless your opponent fogs, victory is assured through combat. If you don't have Ezuri, then you can just make one of those huge creatures become unblockable with Rogue's Passage. You can also sink your infinite mana into an Epic Genesis Wave. This will pull all of your permanents onto the battlefield. You might lose your non-land permanents to the graveyard, but since thanks to Elixir of Immortality, you can shuffle your graveyard into your library along with it in order to have something left. Oh, and also gain 5 life. Alright, so now that I've provided the end result of what the deck aims to accomplish, how do we get there? Well, let's see what else the deck does. I mentioned the mana dorks, but board wipes are a thing, so the deck also has land-based ramp in order to get a quick Marwyn with Nature's Lore, 3 Visits, Myriad Landscape, and Blighted Woodland. Since the deck has so many mana dorks and creatures that tap down for abilities, Harvest Season becomes a stupid card in this deck. Even if you cast it by tapping down 3 mana dorks, that's still 3 basic forests you're getting into play, which is still a huge value. Imagine casting this when you have more creatures tapped down. Additionally, Wood Elves and Forehaven Elf are both elves that ramp when entering the battlefield, as well as triggering Marwyn. In order to get a fast Marwyn, Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are also included. That way, there's a more diversified inventory for mana in order to not have everything ruined by a single spell. Although not a mana rock per se, Emerald Medallion helps green spells cost 1 less, which definitely goes a long way if we're casting multiple spells in a turn. Garruk Wildspeaker is also used as a way to generate mana acceleration by being able to untap up to 2 lands with his first ability. This is a great way to untap utility lands as well as lands like Gaia's Cradle, Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, etc. These lands are crazy good in this deck due to the amount of creatures we have in play. Speaking of which, Garruk can also create a 3/3 beast. Granted, it's not an elf, but it's still a chump blocker in a pinch. His ultimate is another overrun type effect similar to Azuri. So if all goes south, we can also use Garruk to send all our horde all over the table for a possible win. Other elves that can trigger Marwyn, while also providing her with value, are Seeker of Skybreak and Kuriran Ranger. Keep in mind that they can untap any creature you have, not just Marwyn. That being said, untapping any elf that taps down for a bunch of mana is definitely taking the trolley to Value Town. You can also achieve the same results with Wirewood Lodge. Activating this land allows you to untap an elf. This can be used on utility elves as well as mass mana producing ones. However, utility elves aren't the only way to trigger Marwyn. The deck also runs ways of creating elf tokens. Apart from Imperious Perfect, Lis Alana Huntmaster is a busted card in this deck. Every elf we cast will create a 1/1 elf. This essentially doubles the +1/+1 counters that Marwyn can get. The deck can also create elves via spells like Elvish Promenade. Unfortunately, it doesn't count itself while it's on the stack, so it's only as good as the amount of elves you already have in play. That being said, it does have the elf subtype, so it can be tutored with Elvish Harbinger. Yet, the best elf creature generator in the deck is by far Sylvan Offering. Not only is this an amazing mana sink, every elf that enters the battlefield will pump Marwyn. Sure, an opponent gets an XX Tree Folk, but so do we. An opponent will get X 1/1 elf tokens, but so will we, and ours are going to be stronger. Keep in mind also that some of our elves care about all elves on the battlefield, not just the ones we control. This means that Priest of Titania and Wirewood Channeler will tap for a ton of mana. This deck naturally includes Doubling Season as well. Not only will this double the amount of tokens being created, but it also doubles the amount of counters placed on our permanents. So it doubles the +1/+1 counters placed on Marwyn, as well as the counters placed on our planeswalkers. Speaking of which, Freyalise Llanowar's Fury can also create an elf druid every turn thanks to its +2 ability. This token can also tap for 1 green mana, so the synergy is strong in this one. Freyalise can also get rid of a problematic artifact or enchantment with her -2 ability. However, her ultimate is insane in this deck. Even though it'll take a while to get there, she lets us draw cards equal to the amount of green creatures we control. The deck runs other similar ways of drawing into a ton of cards into the deck. Taking advantage of all the elves we can cast or create, the deck runs Collective Unconscious and Shamanic Revelation. These spells, similarly to Freyalise's ultimate, draws cards equal to the amount of elves we control. Since the deck can have a bunch of creatures in play at any turn, this definitely provides some card advantage. Rishkar's Expertise, Soul's Majesty, and Return of the Wildspeaker draws us cards depending on the power of our strongest creature. This deck also makes huge creatures, so these spells can also help us draw deep into the deck, especially since the commander is meant to get huge. As an added bonus, Rishkar's Expertise allows us to cast a spell for converted mana cost 5 or less for free. Return of the Wildspeaker, on top of being an instant, also has the option of giving us Overrun instead. So if we have it in our hands and can win the game that way, it also helps us out with that. And in order to not discard all of those cards just drawn, the deck runs Reliquary Tower. The colorless mana is negligible in a monocolored deck. The Great Henge, Beast Whisperer, and Guardian Project can each draw us a card either when we cast a creature or when a non-token creature enters the battlefield. This means that all of our elves essentially become Elvish Visionaries. As a bonus, Beast Whisperer is an elf, so we remain on theme. The Great Henge is also epic here since it's very possible to consistently cast it for only 2 green mana. On top of the draw, it also puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature cast when it enters the battlefield. It also taps down for 2 green mana while also gaining us 2 life. On the topic of gaining life, the deck runs Well-Wisher and Nissa Revane. Since our elves are weenies until they get pumped, we might be getting smacked around until we're ready to strike back. Nissa's second ability gains us life equal to the amount of elves we control, while Well-Wisher gains us life equal to the amount of elves on the battlefield. This means that if we gave an opponent a ton of elves with Sylvan Offering, that also helps us gain life with Well-Wisher. Recall that whenever we have more life than anyone else, we can close out the game with Squall Line. Oh, and Nissa's ultimate is epic in this deck. She basically cheats all our creatures into play from our library onto the battlefield. A similar effect can be accomplished by resolving kindred summons with enough elves on the battlefield. What's great about this spell is that it's an instant, so it can be done at the end of the turn before ours. Other great ways to take advantage of the amount of creatures in the deck is with Null Mage Shepherd. You can tap down 4 creatures to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Another way to get rid of an artifact or enchantment is with Reclamation Sage. The good thing about these 2 creatures is that they're elves as well. However, if the board is too full of annoying permanents like artifacts and enchantments, you can cast Wave of Vitriol and get rid of all of them. This is especially devastating against artifact-heavy decks, as well as decks that use enchantments to control, since Pillow Forts can really hinder our beatdown win con. It also gets rid of all non-basic lands, so you can really hurt multicolored players with this as well. Taking advantage of huge creatures, the deck also runs Monstrous Onslaught. If Marwyn is big enough, for just 5 mana, we could very easily destroy most creatures on the board. If any of our creatures have infinite power thanks to the combos mentioned near the beginning of the video, then we can definitely deal infinite damage to any combination of creatures on the battlefield. And if we can't get rid of creatures because it has Indestructible, the deck runs Kenrith's Transformation, Song of the Dryads, and Lignify. These auras basically render commanders useless, which is better than just having them be sent back to the controller's command zone. For anything else, there's Beast Within. This is definitely a great catch-all that should go in all green decks. But what about opponents interacting with us? Well, I already mentioned Akroma's Memorial giving our creatures protection from black and red, but the deck also runs Rapid Vigor and Heroic Intervention. Rapid Vigor regenerates all of our creatures, while Heroic Intervention straight up gives our permanents hexproof and indestructible. Izuri can also regenerate our other elves, but at least Rapid Vigor regenerates everything at instant speed for just 2 mana. Yavimaya Hollow can also be used to regenerate a creature while also being able to produce mana. Now that I mentioned hexproof, Swiftfoot Boots and Lightning Greaves are obviously included in the deck. What's great about Lightning Greaves is that since its equip cost is 0, we can move it from Mana Dork to Mana Dork in order to tap them down for mana the same turn they entered the battlefield. Bow of Nylea is not only used to give our attacking creatures Death Touch, but it can also be used to put a +1/+1 counter on Marwyn or Joraga Warcaller. It can also be used to shock a creature with flying, gain 3 life, or, more importantly, bottom deck 4 cards from our graveyard. Cavern of Souls is also included to protect the deck against counterspells since all of the creatures in the deck are elves. The rest of the deck are mana-producing lands, Ancient Tomb, Temple of the False God, and 20 basic forests. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Marwyn the Nurturer. One thing I'd like to point out is that Marwyn is an incredibly cheap commander and definitely achievable with a very tight budget. However, I wanted to see how optimal it would be to have her at the helm of a big mana elf tribal deck. No doubt other channels may try and build her on a budget since she's not being used in Modern or Pioneer, so her price will definitely stay as low as it is. That being said, as is, this deck is a lot of fun to pilot and play. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the Brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.